And our presenter today is Matt Sienkiewicz. He's an assistant professor at the Communications Department at Boston College. And I've been reading a number of his articles on media support. And this is an area of research and activity that I think is understudied, basically. The whole issue of media intervention, the way in which governments decide to make grants, evaluate those grants, and control the recipients of these grants. Not control, but in some ways control.
Sometimes.
So I think this talk, Shaping Palestinian Media, a case study of Western funding, etc., is really something we should all spend more time on and more attention with. This issue of Western funding and what its implications are and how media is shaped. So with that, I think I'll just turn it over.
Great. Thank you.
And that was Monroe Prize.
Thank you very much, Monroe. Thanks, everyone, for having me. It's good to see some friendly faces. Nice to see you again, Elihu. So yes, just as Monroe said, I'm going to be talking about Palestinian media produced indigenously, so produced in the West Bank is the scope of my research, and that is paid for at an institutional level by the West. I have a longer project that goes back to my dissertation research that looks at this cross-media, looks at it through film, looks at it through television. Here I'm going to focus in on one area. I'm going to talk about television. I'm going to talk about people who have behind the scenes control over it. I'm going to look at gender in that issue. So organizations that are paid for by the West, considering the question of how gender power is potentially balanced out through the interference, the funding of the West, and the limitations and advantages that come from that. So I'm going to start with a little background, talk about the main organization that I'm going to look at. This serves a double purpose. It gives some context for the actual case studies I'm going to give you, and it's also it gives you a sense of sort of this thing called media assistance and how it works in the Palestinian territories. So the Ma'an network is a network of small stations. It is slowly transforming from a UHF network to a satellite station, but I'm going to talk about it in terms of that UHF because that's the bulk of its history. And so it's a group of stations sort of tied together somewhat like our PBS networks are, tied together through mutual productions, that sort of thing. And it's scattered about the West Bank. They had things in Gaza, but those no longer exist. And it is headlined, its capital is in Bethlehem, so that's why I have the slightly larger little circle there. It's located throughout the West Bank, and it reaches most West Bank viewers. You can get it on a television with a UHF antenna. Now, it is funded by the West, and it's not something that's any sort of secret. The bulk of the money actually comes from the United States. I'll talk about that history as I go through the presentation. But I want to make clear this is something that's right out there. You walk in, you see the Palestinian flag, you see the Danish flag, and you see the Dutch flag. That's who supports this. So it's right out there on the surface, right? So this is an organization, it has a website, it has a variety of television stations that are there to produce media locally, but are funded by the West. So the incident that I want to use to kind of kick off this discussion is actually a sort of research coincidence, something that took place when I was doing the research for this project. I had scheduled a day, and I had scheduled what I thought to be sort of two separate events. For one, I was going to go to Ramallah, and I was going to see the show hosted by Amira Hananiah. And I want to see this because Amira got her training at the Ma'an network. She ended up moving on and working for the government station, but this is where she got her original training, and I wanted to see sort of what happens to people who start being trained in these Western kind of contexts and then move out beyond it. And so I went, and what I saw was quite new. This was the first Palestinian governmental show that was governmental sort of public affairs show that was hosted by a woman. So there were women who did other programming for certain. They tended to be sort of shows that were gendered towards female hosts. Children's shows, prisoner shows is a sort of female gendered thing in Palestinian media. And then I saw here was Amira, and she was going head to head with very established men, really impressive kind of people. This is a Jordanian general. And this was new. This was new in terms of locally produced Palestinian media. So I went and I talked to Amira, I kind of talked to some people there, got a sense of what she was doing. And then I went, as I did most days during my research, through the Kalendia checkpoint from Ramallah into Jerusalem. And I went to a second appointment. This is Palestinian Media Watch. It's an organization that is in Jerusalem, and their job, their self-appointed job, is to police the contents of Palestinian media. They look at every single report, every single utterance, every single newspaper. They have quite an impressive sort of research capacity. If you could get your students to do this kind of research, you would be happy, at least in terms of the devotion they have to it. And they sit and they watch every minute of the programming to try to find things that they can sort of tell. Right? They can go tell on an organization for advocating for violence against Americans, for being against the two-state solution, for being anti-Semitic. And I walked in, and I met Harel Zioni, and lo and behold, he was actually reviewing yesterday's taping of that same program that I'd just seen. And all of a sudden, this sort of occurred to me, these worlds are very intimately tied together. These are not two sort of separate spheres. The work that's being done by Palestinian Media Watch is in direct sort of discussion with what I had just been seeing. And so I sat down with Harel and I watched him watch Amira, who I had just been watching myself. And we watched the show, and he was very good. He had a lot of nuance in his understanding of it. And I waited for him to be done, and then I asked him, so what'd you think? And I was expecting a litany of kind of like, she said this, she used the word Jew in the wrong way, and she didn't talk about the borders right. And then he looked at me and says, it was great. I said, it was great? He goes, yeah, it was fantastic. And so, all right, I want to know what makes it great. And his response essentially was that she avoided these issues. She talked almost exclusively internally about Palestinian politics. She fell back on the sort of professionalism norms that we're accustomed to in the West, and she didn't really stir up any of the things that he's there to look at. And this sort of occurred to me that this could have something to do with Amira's background working in Western-funded organizations, sort of getting her training there. And it reminded me of a quote I once received in an interview. This was with John Marks. He is the president of Search for Common Ground. They fund much media throughout the world. They do a lot in the Palestinian territories and elsewhere. They do conflict resolution media. Right? Their media is supposed to help solve conflicts. And John Marks told me that Maan confronts every possible conflict in Palestinian life other than the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So it's like everything about the Super Bowl except football. Right? It doesn't. There are other things to talk about, right? But it's an interesting approach, right? And this has to do with the pressures that come to bear outside of the region. It has a lot to do with American funding. It has a lot to do with the American Congress and the way they watch over it. And that's what I wanted to pursue in this particular research question. So I want to ask, in what ways have Western, quote-unquote, independent media projects both expanded and limited female and feminist expression in the Palestinian public sphere? So in what ways have these stations that have been produced by the West helped open up possibilities for females to get control in terms of production? And in what ways has that maybe come with strings? Right? Has that come with restrictions, either implied or explicit? Very quickly, I don't want to dive into it too far, but in terms of theoretical framework, this is obviously drawing back on modernization theory, looking at people like Pai and Lerner and sort of looking at it from that perspective, but also, of course, critics of modernization theory who see the Orientalist implications of it. I'm also drawing upon Dr. Crady's work here on critical transculturalism. I want to look at some of these interactions as being mutually constitutive in certain ways, that it's not just a one-way street with regards to the West and these organizations, that there's agency on both sides, even if it is structured within dominance. And then, of course, discussions of the Arab public sphere and feminism. People like Mark Lynch and Suha Sabah, who have done a lot of great work showing us that our stereotypes, our guesses about what it's like in the Arab public sphere are not quite, are almost never right. That they show a much more limited, we assume a more limited engagement than there actually is. Also, very quickly, give you a sense of where I'm coming from. Why should you listen to me? So I did 2.5 years off and on, 16 months during that 2.5 years, primarily in Ramallah and Bethlehem, also in Jerusalem. And I break down my research into 3 major areas. One was sort of direct observation of production. This is a sort of college bowl show called Najum. meaning stars, and you might think the stars would be the kids who are doing the college quiz questions, but they maybe are more directly the EU stars, right? That's what it's named after. It's funded by the EU, and it's a fun thing to talk about. The questions are all these sort of arcane things about the EU, right? What's the top export of Switzerland? This kind of thing, right? Very limiting, right? So I went and watched these shows both in terms of the big stuff and little stuff, independent filmmaking. I did interviews with producers, my friend Mohammed Ghanayem. I also went into Palestine TV and did some research there, Lina al-Saqa. Sort of tried to get a scope of not just the stuff that was being produced at places like Ma'an, but also sort of what the governmental alternatives were. And I did archival research. So in many cases, this had to do with sort of going through old tapes. Tapes, at least for a long period of time, were very valuable resources, so a lot of stuff gets taped over. It can be quite an interesting battle trying to figure out what's there. Organization sometimes can be lacking, although that's actually a pretty good example. And a lot of the archival research I did was in terms of the documents that come from the West to the local producers. All right, and this is generally how it works. There might be a sort of American advisor on board, but for the most part, these productions that take place at Ma'an happen locally. And the people who are working are local, but they're working under the guidance of this sort of thing. This is what's called a curriculum sheet. So when you produce a show at a place like Ma'an, if the money's coming from the US State Department via a place like Search for Common Ground, you get the sort of list of things that your media is supposed to fix, right? So you've got issues here, brain drain, tolerance, right? And you've got sort of how that media is supposed to fix the problem. And I show this to you for a couple of reasons. One, to just give you a sense of the conditions under which shows are being produced. There was 12 pages of this for one soap opera and going through it. So one soap opera of 7 episodes is supposed to instill respect for intellectual property, stop the brain drain, create tolerance, and stop discrimination against women, plus 11 and a half other pages. So you get a sense of sort of the, while nobody's necessarily on the ground watching, there is some significant demands. I also point to this bottom part here, discrimination against women. And I like to note how it very seems to quickly sort of evolve from questions like intellectual property and brain drain, which are really economic questions in a lot of ways. And discrimination against women are sort of right in that discussion, right? So when we talk about gender balance as promoted by the West, we want to look at, yes, in terms of human rights, but I think we also want to look at it in terms of economics, look at it in terms of the sort of political and economic order that the West envisions for a place like the Palestinian territories. I'll go through this relatively quickly to get to sort of my main research, but I want to give some sense of the history of women in the Palestinian public sphere. This does not do this subject justice. It's just sort of to bring it up to the moment. Around 1933, 1936, the first time people writing about this phenomenon. It has to do mostly with the wives of religious leaders giving speeches in public spaces about the question of Jewish immigration, about the question of Palestinian nationalism. Fudwa Tukan, who was the wife of the head of the Palestinian radio broadcasting service back then, became sort of the national poet. And I point this out to make sure it's clear that there was not an absence of female voices before the West shows up. I want to make sure I don't give anything like that impression. 1948, after the creation of the State of Israel, Isam Abdul Hadi becomes a really important public figure, speaking on behalf of refugees, primarily women and children. And I point this out because the idea of the international sphere, right? She was talking at the United Nations. The international sphere playing a role in encouraging female participation publicly is something that goes back quite a ways. And we also have people like Salafa Jadallah and other female journalists and filmmakers in the 1970s, also producing things largely for an international audience to try to get the world aware of Palestinian issues. And then we move to where the story of Ma'an starts, which I want to detail for you. So with the Oslo Accords in 1993, you get the first ever availability for Palestinian spectrum space. Before then, the Israelis simply didn't allow it. There was no such thing as locally produced Palestinian electronic media. No such thing. In 1993, not only did they get the very limited control over land that comes with the Oslo Accords, but also a little tiny slice of the spectrum, right? But there was nothing in the way of sort of pre-existing infrastructure to do this. And as a result, what popped up were all these little tiny stations, these little tiny storefront stations, as they're often described, which were not licensed by the government. And a lot of people look back at it and they argue that really what was going on here, why these extra legal stations were allowed, is that they served as quote-unquote facts in the air. So like an Israeli settlement in the West Bank sort of establishes facts on the ground to establish a claim to it. These little stations popped up and they were allowed to exist outside the government to sort of claim the space as Palestinian space. And these actually thrived for a few years, mostly rebroadcasting media from elsewhere. So we've got Egyptian films and then also collections of, this is a picture of it from last year, but it's the same sort of thing that's been going on for 2 decades now. Disney stuff, so Jungle to Jungle, George of the Jungle, George of the Jungle 2. I don't have a theory as to the connection between this and Jungles, but you get a sense of the kind of stuff that's going on from these stations. In the late 90s, the Danish government sort of gets an idea. I've done some fairly extensive interviews with people in Denmark who worked on this issue. And the way they tell the story is that at the time of the Oslo Accords, the Danes were jealous. The Danes felt that they had done the groundwork to establish the Oslo Accords, and damn it, it should have been called the Copenhagen Accords, right? Now, if you look back, they kind of dodged a bullet on that one. It's, they're no longer of that opinion. But at the time they were, right? And so the question came, how can we sort of show the world we have an important role to play here, right? And they looked and sort of the basic stuff was taken care of. The French were doing the agricultural work. The US was building all the roads. Italy was doing a lot of work with schools. But media, because it had been suppressed for so long, was available. And so what they did is they found those stations that were broadcasting Egyptian movies and these sorts of things, and they tried to pull them together into something called the Shams network, the Sun network. And this is a precursor to MAN, and that was supposed to be very much a sort of a European public service model. And that's where it got a start from. That came to a fairly abrupt halt with the Second Intifada. This is 2001, 2000, and you have this terrible violence, you've got reprisals, you've got attacks on cities, you've got suicide bombings, back and forth, impossible to sort of stop this cycle of violence, and the Danes leave. They can't afford it, it's too dangerous, and these stations start to really dry up. Along the same time, the Palestinian Broadcasting Corporation starts sort of getting its act together. And they create a satellite station. This is a picture of their headquarters, which actually was also bombed during the Second Intifada, and they never quite fixed the stuff over there on the right. They start establishing, and this marginalizes that Shams network even further. But perhaps most importantly, you get the rise of satellite TV. In the 1990s, it was cost prohibitive for most people to buy satellite dishes. By the 2000s, it becomes much more affordable. $300–400, you can get a satellite dish and get hundreds of stations. So this Shams network, which seems so promising as sort of a peace-building kind of entity that the Danes sought, is now in real trouble. So it's about 2003, and in come the Americans, right? And the Americans, of course, have big problems in 2003. They still can't find the weapons of mass destruction. There's shifting rhetorics, right? What are we doing in the Middle East? Well, it can't be about finding these weapons. It can't be about neutralizing Saddam. We've already done that. Why are we still there? It's nation building. And it's very curious, if you look at the rhetoric of George Bush during this period, he always talks about we're over there to help build nations for the Iraqis and the Palestinians and everybody else. Right? And he sort of equated these two things as part of one effort. It's very common in the discourse at the time. And at the time, money floods in for work in the Palestinian territories. And that's where the MAN network comes from. That's the United States coming in via search for common ground and trying to reestablish the Shams network that the Danes had begun as a place for quote-unquote independent media under the auspices of American sort of supervision. Right? And the idea is to be non-religious, to be non-political in whatever sense that's possible, right? They throw the word independent and objective around a lot in very sort of difficult and sometimes complex ways that need further consideration. But they establish this network, they throw a whole lot of money at it, and it actually gets going. It does exist, and it has become a real competitor for the governmental television. Now, what I want to look at specifically with regards to it is the question of gender. Is the question of this one sort of issue that the U.S. kind of looked to. So if you remember, you go back to that quote by John Marx, right? Ma'an was going to look at every conflict possible, except for the conflict that sort of, shapes everyday life, right? And in going through archival research, what I found is that when Ma'an set up, let's say, training events for journalists, especially for female journalists, they were always listed as conflict resolution training events, because that's what you're there for, right? And then you look at the conflicts that they're solving generational conflicts. Dad doesn't like your haircut. How do you talk to him properly? They're gender conflicts. So, you go to a place where, there's should the women be allowed to learn the subject at school kind of things. Out of sort of the 10 or 12 that I found, only one of them sort of was a training based on Sarajevo, and it was very short. And so with this, you see sort of a change of the word conflict to mean gender, right? And that, I think, is indicative of the organization in many ways. But I also want to look specifically at how they work to put women in positions of power, in positions where they at least were able to get behind the camera and make decisions. And I want to look at four factors. I guess I already did the last one there. And I want to apply these to the careers of two people, not necessarily because they are representative, but because they sort of display the possibilities. So one, when the U.S. comes in, when Ma'an is funded by the West, primarily by the State Department, they start demanding college degrees for new media hires. U.S. funding is notoriously paperwork heavy. It demands all sorts of sort of proof of the person being the person they are, and one thing that they asked for was that everybody have a college degree. Now, this was not intended to have an impact on gender, but I would argue that it had a significant impact. One, the tradition of hiring in the media business in the Palestinian territories, much like throughout the whole world, often was very nepotistic. Often these stations had started by people who had good videography businesses going, wedding videography, this kind of thing, and sort of rolled that over into a television station. And, it's a family business. You hire your nephew, right? You know him, you'll teach him, and that's so on and so forth, right? You just didn't hire your niece generally. It just wasn't sort of how the family business worked. Well, the U.S. starts demanding college degrees. And lo and behold, and especially in Bethlehem, which is where the headquarters of the network is, Bethlehem University is about 70-75% female. Furthermore, the journalism major is even more female. There's a lot of men are in the sciences and so on and so forth. So they need to hire these people with college degrees at the entry level, and all of a sudden there's these flood of women producers, of women candidates for the jobs. Now, in speaking to the people at Ma'an, they are insistent that this is exactly what they wanted. They just couldn't necessarily say this, right? They needed the cover of the West in a certain way to get this done. It was breaking sort of local tradition. Secondly, there's de facto reservation of 2 managerial level positions for women. There is nothing written about this, but they've been going now for about 12 years, and they've always, even though they've gone through many candidates, out of how many? Oh, not out of more. Out of probably, I'd say 7 people at the level of the manager. 2 are reserved for women, and they always have been these 2 positions. The director of programming has been a woman, for example. The director of fundraising, as development, I suppose, has also always been a woman. And that sort of created positions right there. Lastly, and sort of, I think, interestingly, they instituted a policy of no night shifts for women. Now, this is not something that's listed anywhere in any of the documentation that comes from the West. And this is a moment where I think you can see the mutually constitutive nature, potentially, of these kind of interactions. Ma'an instituted this policy because a problem for women getting into entry-level positions is that generally, especially these are 24-hour news services, you have to work at night. There are issues culturally there. There are issues with regards to people's reputations, the sort of very unfair implications that might be taken from somebody working at night, drove many women out of their field. Ma'an used, I think quite explicitly in this case, the West as a cover. They said, we need to hire women, and so you guys, even though you just got off the night shift, you're back on it. Right, and this is a big issue. This is something that would be very controversial and sort of threatens organizational stability, but the consistent funding that's coming in from Ma'an sort of balance that out. Coming in from the West to Ma'an kind of balances that out. There are not that many jobs that are around week to week. And by the U.S. sort of ensuring that, they were able to get people to sort of agree to this shift, which opened up the possibility for many women to start working. So I want to do 2 quick case studies and then wrap up. I want to talk about Nahed Abu Tuaima, who actually just left as head of programming. She now is at Birzeit University as an instructor. Nahed grew up in Gaza, and if you were to sort of look at her family, it's shocking that she would come to this sort of position. She was the first woman in her family, which is a large family, to go to college. She went and she graduated from the Islamic University with a degree in journalism. And she came out of that position and there was nothing there for her. This is the mid-1990s. There was no jobs. She was able to do a little bit of work for the women's committees that were established with the Oslo Accords in 1993. So there were some local resources for establishing women as researchers and journalists. But that dried up, and then she had no choice but to kind of look for a job at a newspaper. She did that, and she worked for a few weeks and was about to quit. They were giving her all night shifts, and her brothers were saying that you have to stop doing this. You can't work at night. She says the culture was extremely inhospitable. And that was going to be the end of her career. She was going to have to go do something else. But somebody over in the UK actually found her report that she had done for the women's committees on these very controversial topics of early marriage and domestic abuse. And the British happened to run this organization on the station called Al-Quds Educational Television, which is part of the Ma'an network. It's dedicated specifically to women's and children's issues. They said, Nahed, this work is fantastic. We want you on board here. They hired her as a show producer, and eventually she rose to the role of station manager. A year or two later, she was hired to be the manager of the entire Ma'an network. Right, this was the head of programming. This was when they sort of started this process of having a woman in this position. It was extraordinarily controversial. Some of these station managers at the lower levels quit. They left. They said they wouldn't work under a woman. But she sort of stuck in there. Ma'an stuck with them. They said, nope, this is how we're going to do it. And they kept her. Not only was she able to sort of become this unprecedentedly sort of important person with regards to making decisions for other producers, she also started hiring more and more women. And one of the women that she hired was Amira Hanania, who you saw earlier in the presentation. Now I want to talk a little bit about Amira, and it'll kind of link up together with the story of Nahed. So before Amira met Nahed, she was working at a small station in Bethlehem as the only woman who wasn't a secretary, and she describes her job as being a professional flirt. She would go to places where there was no real news story, but happened to be near a business that they wanted to advertise with. They wanted to sell advertisement to. She would go and pretend to record a story and kind of flirt with the guy that was owning the store and saying, oh, yeah, you know, you should consider buying some ads with us. This was work that was well below her capability. She'd actually done radio work before at a really small station that showed that. She was hired by the Ma'an network. Now I want to give you a clip of of a documentary that kind of shows her work firsthand, and I think is rather indicative of her work while she was at the Ma'an network.
You know why I brought this?
Why?
When I go to the court, it's a religious, sorry. So I'm gonna meet Sheikh. She must be restrictive, so I have to wear it on my shoulders like this. Some wives and some women really face some difficulties to get divorced or to get their kids in their nursery. It's not one report. So it's a full project. What would be a success to change it?
بداية بنية التشريع عندنا في البلد وقانون الأحوال الشخصية بالسابق، هل بتشوف من القضايا اللي بتجوك يوميا إنه منصف للمرأة؟ أو هل بيشكل كشك النساء من إنه غير منصف ومشكل؟
يعني القانون عالج مشاكل كثير في الأحوال الشخصية، لكن احنا تقدمنا منذ عدة سنوات بمشروع قانون أحوال شخصية فلسطيني وهو مقدم أمام المجلس التشريعي منذ عدة سنوات ولم يتم مناقشته أتوقع حتى الآن.
احنا حنحكي لكن احنا بس بدنا جواب هاي النقطة إنه هل سن 14
Just give you some sense of where she went from and to, right? So this is when she's working for the Ma'an network. She's working under the auspices of this American sort of oversight, where she's done all this training on gender equality, gender issues, and she's asking tough questions of important male figures. And this is something that was not going on anywhere else in the country at that time at the local level. She ended up sort of moving up within the world of Middle Eastern media. She worked for Mustaqbal TV out of Lebanon. She was the first Palestinian woman to produce a documentary for Al Jazeera. And then eventually she got her own show on the governmental station that I mentioned before, at which point she got a chance to hire her own producer. And against the wishes of virtually everybody, she hired Ms. Sana Khudar, who, as you can see, is a woman. And this was despite the large majority of applicants being more sort of traditionally qualified men, right? And so you do see, starting with these decisions made from the West, a certain sort of train of women being hiring, a sort of cascading that does take place. And this is something that feminist scholars point to as being central to changing certain male-dominated elements of the media field. Now, I want to conclude, and I want to put these things back into a certain context, right? One, I do want to note that we have here an example of media assistance as a potential check against patriarchal patterns, right? But it is not necessarily one. It's not a cause, right? It's something that's going on as one of many causes. You also see changes within local Palestinian institutions, liberalizations that are taking place over the same time. You see the impact of satellite television sort of playing a concurrent role with all of this. But I do think you see, if you look at the patterns, you see some significant evidence of real progress being made on that front. We also see a limitation, I think, of the sphere of expression that takes place. Scholars have talked about the NGOization of women's movements, and I think you can look to some of these figures that are sort of in this world, and it does perhaps limit the way in which they're able to express femininity, express women's issues, and express Palestinian issues in a certain sense. This notion of female success as a product of career ascent, I think, is very embedded into the work of the people who started at Ma'an, and you can sort of see it deeply in it. You also see certain acceptance of hegemonic structures, which to me are actually rather shocking. When Amira left Ma'an and she took on the show that I showed you at the beginning, she was able to book her own guests. And very surprisingly to me, for the first about 16, 17 months, she didn't book a single woman as a guest. And her explanation was sort of, that's not what people want, right? That's not what I'm here to do. And I think you get a certain sense of that's not sort of the career path that she was trying to take. You also, of course, see the limitation of her discussion on issues regarding Israel. I think that if you're getting funded from the West, then there are certain red lines you just can't cross, and you might stay away from entirely. And I think that is a limitation that we have to see. I also do want to point to this being an example, nonetheless, as an instance of some resistance within a structure of dominance. You do find that there are things going on here where you have the local institution, in this case mostly the Ma'an network, acting inside this situation where they're clearly being dominated by their funders, but they're still being clever. They're still finding ways to express goals that they want. They're finding ways to change the rules in situations that the West has sort of no idea with. And I think this issue of night shifts is a nice example of that. There's really no evidence that anybody outside of Ma'an knew this. I think this was a goal that Ma'an always had, and they sort of used this situation as a cover. And I also think if you look at some of their programming, you'll find very sort of subtle ways in which they do resist against it. So I don't want to ignore the structure. Obviously, the structure is what I've been talking about primarily throughout the talk. But I do want to say that if you go there and you look at the way it actually is instilled, you can find important moments of dominance, of resistance to that dominance. So, I mean, one sort of last image and then a couple of clearing points. So we've got Amira here. On the one hand, this is sort of an amazing thing. We have a Palestinian woman standing right next to Hillary Clinton, asking her questions. She was actually asked to do the first ever joint interview with an Israeli and a Palestinian journalist in the United States. So her and a journalist from Israel's Channel 2 interviewed Hillary Clinton. This is a tremendous bit of progress. It's not entirely attributable to Western intervention, but Western intervention played part of the story. And I think that's something to look at. You can also look at the ways in which she might have shaped herself to fit that role, right? The dueling pantsuits here, I think, are indicative of something that's not strictly petty, right?
And the Photoshop, of course.
and of course, the fact that she was asked means that she was not dangerous. means she was not somebody who was going to pull out the questions that really might cut to the heart of some of these issues regarding American implications with regards to the occupation. So, some concluding thoughts. I want to look at here journalism beyond political economy. I want to look at media systems beyond imperialism, but not without dominating structures. Right? And I want to look at local production and foreign policies, in some cases mutually constitutive, in some cases informing one another in ways that if you take that strict top-down economic look, you don't quite see. So with that, I thank you for your attention.